Hi, I'm Lauren Edmunds. I'm the founder and owner of a school that supports children with learning delays. I'm hoping this space gives you something to think about. I'm going to talk about the idea of having a switched on brain versus a switched off brain, and how practical we can get around this and why it is so vitally important. And I can talk about it in the context of a typically developing child in a typically set up school system. And I can equally talk about it in a atypically developing child that's in a system that is not typical at all. And if we take that big range of children and their development, let's talk into this idea of a switched on brain versus a switched off brain. And it's one of the reasons why I am so concerned about young children, in particular children who are struggling because they move into screen time and this idea of a switched off brain far too early, far too long. I believe that it's impacting their overall ability to think and brain growth. So moving away from the screen time thing and moving back onto this idea of switched on versus switched off, there's a story that Anat Benil talks about, or rather she reflects on a child that's sitting on the floor, a typically developing child, a toddler, perhaps pre-walking. So I would say 6 months old. They're sitting on the floor, you're standing next to them, and you turn to them and they notice the turning to them, and they kind of replicate that movement, and you bend down, you make motions to pick them up. So you bend your knees slightly, you lean in towards them, you put both your hands out, and the typically developing child with a typically developing brain will anticipate what's about to happen, and they will shift their upper body up and towards you. They might even pull their arms out and towards you in this anticipation of being picked up. And I love this idea of that because we've all seen it, we've all experienced it, either with our own children or with ourselves. This idea of, I get what you're trying to do and I'm moving in towards you. And that is a brain that is alive, alert, awake, and moving into itself and moving into the process. And that's what we want when children are learning. So I'm going to talk about a little boy that we work with who sits on the autism spectrum. He's also regarded as nonverbal, and nonverbal is sort of a really big range and comes from different aspects. So it's not a single diagnosis that we can necessarily understand as I say it. But if I talk into this child, there wasn't necessarily a progression towards verbal communication. There was, he does a lot of AAC therapy, and there was a move towards autonomy, but not co-play. He struggled to relate to other children, couldn't play, couldn't communicate, sort of lost in his own world. And this understanding of receptive versus expressive language was interesting for us to observe. And the development was for us, it was definitely this idea of developing communication, augmentative and alternative communication. So it could be AAC devices. We didn't look at sign for him, but there were a number of ways in which we could help him to understand us and for us to help ourselves, for him to be understood by us. So there's this process going on, but in the background, the underlying driver needed to be created because we didn't want him to be a passive recipient of any kind of therapy or intervention or process or even social environment. We didn't want him to be a passive recipient of it. Again, going back to this analogy of the little baby or the 6-month-old sitting on the floor, and you bend down to pick him up and he doesn't move at all, and you've got to do all the work of lifting. We want sort of a 50-50 or a 40-60 or whatever the percentage. We want engagement from the child. So if we look at it not in terms of the story I'm telling of being picked up, but in terms of communication, what we wanted was this little boy's need to talk needed to come from inside him, not externally from us. We could drive and give therapies and give opportunities, but we needed him to get to the point where he had a reason to work on this. And that is what's happening at the moment. He has found a social reason because we realized that it was not going to be necessarily in an academic setting, though we are seeing that as well. In fact, let me go back a second. It actually happened in multiple settings, in multiple opportunities he had to communicate, and he couldn't find his words. But because we held his esteem well, we kept him giving him feelings of safety, physical safety, but emotional safety, social safety, and tugging at those little edges around him, just giving him opportunities, never forcing, but encouraging, giving him space to move into the connection with his friends, the connection with work, even the connection with his adults, and getting him to find within himself the reason to work at this. And he's there. He has found a reason in himself to bring himself to the table, to turn around, lift his arms and look up as if, okay, you want to pick me up? I see it now. What can I do in this process? And it's just the most mind-blowing thing. He is bringing himself to the table. And this, with all the other therapeutic and academic and social and emotional and connection work we've been doing, keeping him safe, he's now safe enough. He's finding a path to developing the skill he didn't have. And the communication is coming in a remarkable way. The communication looping is developing. He's having actual conversations, backwards and forwards, conversations with his peers where his answers make sense to the question, and he's able to answer a second question and autonomously make decisions about what he wants to do next and communicate those decisions so that his communication partners understand him and can accommodate for his choices, his preferences, which is incredible because he wasn't able to communicate his choice and preference before. And now, because his communication has developed, because he has wanted to communicate, and he is working incredibly hard, to recognize what he's doing is just remarkable. He's 10 years old, and he's working on actually getting words out. He's working on the practice of his mouth, on how his mouth moves and his tongue moves in order to get the words out, in order to pronounce them correctly. He's listening more with more attention to how a word is being pronounced. He's repeating it. He's storing that information, and he's using it in a generalized way in multiple environments. And this growth, I believe, is going to blow up. Not because it is now got to the point where it has been driven by him and not by his therapists. And the work of the therapists and the teachers and his peers and his parents has been to make room and develop the skills, but make the space for him to find who he is in this process and lift his arms to be picked up and to move forward and to stand up on his own. And to think about this in terms of having your brain switched on versus switched off. If the therapies and the school approach and the parent approach had been to automate some behaviors, to not engage him, to not follow the child, but to do it on our agenda rather than his agenda, he would potentially not have got to the point, at least he would not have got to the point this early, this young, this soon after intervention started. It's been about a year and a half where he is realizing, hey, I have a say in this. I can do this. And this energy and drive that he's got is giving him more energy and drive to do it. So he's doing really, really hard things, but to him, they don't feel hard because they're linked in with his internal goals, and the progress is there, and he's recognizing it because he's also seeing our quiet enthusiasm and joy for his link to us. So if that, in this extreme case, in the somewhat extreme case, doesn't make a case for developing or allowing to build in the child their own desire for something rather than it being your desire for them to achieve, can they find their own desire to achieve? That's when the remarkable plasticity of the brain kicks in and children change and their IQ drives up and their abilities drive up, and what we thought they would never be able to do, they start being able to do, not because we are moving them, but because they have the actual inner skill. And that story of a child who is struggling with a number of diagnoses, if you take it away from that child and you move into children in a mainstream environment, even children who are succeeding excessively, they're academically succeeding, they are succeeding at sport, they've got a great social group, all of those kids, is it being driven by their need or from somewhere else? And how do we switch it into their need? Because when when it's something that they really want to go for, they develop goal orientation. They develop the ability to plan. They develop good habits. They develop a longevity. They stop procrastinating. They start monitoring themselves. They start leaning into it. They start getting all the beautiful hormones that they need in order to grow and build their brains and their entire bodies. And they start to be a child with agency, a child that is moving into exactly who they are and developing the skills and abilities in order to move forward even beyond their wildest dreams. So having a switched on brain requires an internal knowledge. A switched off brain is a child who's pushed all his locus of control outside of himself, and he sits and waits for an adult or somebody else to trigger something for him so that he can progress, as opposed to getting the trigger inside himself and getting to know himself better and driving through these processes. It's been a beautiful journey to watch, and it continues. And I hope that the story gives you some sense of where you need to be from a parent and from a teacher's point of view. How do I develop in my child an inner sense of wanting? And I have to say that it takes time. This is not a sit down and have a talk with them kind of thing. It's almost a push and pull. Can I pull back a bit? Can I give them some space? Can I allow them to fail a bit? If they fail, how do I process that? What kind of thought process do I want in my child that gets them to be happy, healthy, progressing? It's an interesting question. I enjoy the question very much.